What are the major logical fallacies? I am going to provide for you, as part of this course material, I'm going to provide for you a list of most of the major logical fallacies, and I think there's probably about 30 on that list. I would encourage you to keep that list and keep it somewhere safe and refer to it often, because these will not just help you as you continue to study, as you continue to read books, critique books, and use critiques of books as part of your essays. It's going to be tremendously helpful for that. For example, you can say, so-and-so is using an ad hominem attack against so-and-so, or somebody is using circular reasoning, or somebody is making an appeal to authority here, therefore their views are invalid for these reasons. That's going to be tremendously helpful. Your teachers are going to love that if you use that in your papers. But also, it's going to be useful for you, again, thinking, debating with people in the future, thinking clearly for yourself, having that full storeroom of information, and also presenting your claims, presenting your ideas in a compelling way. So I categorize them into three categories. One is fallacies of form. If the argument is not constructed correctly, then it falls apart. It's not valid. Secondly, problems with the premise. There's some ways that a truth claim cannot be stated. And finally, just some other miscellaneous ones that are very common. So fallacies of form, a question-begging statement. Most of the time when we speak, we're assuming one or maybe even both of the truth claims that our conclusion is resting upon. For example, I gave the example earlier, science disproves Christianity. You hear this over and over. But how somebody would actually support that is not often stated, and that could be supported in many different ways. Or people could attempt to prove that in various different ways. Christianity could say, or Christians could say, science proves Christianity. So when somebody makes a claim, you need to push them to say, how do you prove that? And a way that you would push them, perhaps if you're in a more technical environment, is just to say, that's a question-begging statement. And when you say that, what you're saying is, show me what your premises are. How do you get from here to here? What are your premises? That's a question. If it's missing one or more premise, then it's a question-begging statement. Secondly, circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is when one of the premises is used as the conclusion. So, for example, science is true because it can be proven scientifically. People will say things like that. But that doesn't make sense. The scientific method can't prove itself. You understand it's hard to illustrate perhaps with blocks, but you understand the conclusion can't be part of the premises. You have to prove it by something independent outside of itself. And there's other fallacies of form that I'll give you on the handout. Let's look at problematic premises. Some very obvious ones that you might know of is anecdotal experience. So in your term papers, your teachers will often say you can't use your personal experience as proof of something. The bottom line is that your own personal experience, I mean, yes, maybe you had a wonderful experience of God, but that doesn't prove that, that doesn't prove the argument for everyone else. You need to bring some good evidence other than just your own personal experience. Or say, for example, you're examining disease. I'm not saying that your own personal testimony is invalid. I'm saying that it's not a powerful and compelling component of an argument. So testimony is one thing. It is interesting what happened to you, but how are we going to provide proof that is going to compel people logically to believe Christianity? I think these two are separate. You can send me a question about that if you would like. Again, not saying that personal testimony is not valid, but if it's anecdotal experience, it's only so valid. For example, where would we be if our knowledge of medicine was based only on anecdotal experience? Well, so-and-so ate garlic before bed and they died the next day. I mean, that was, perhaps a real experience that somebody had. Well, there's all sorts of variables in anecdotal experience. We don't know, his previous heart condition. We don't know all sorts of things. That's why we need to have solid research. People need to investigate things and rule out some of the extraneous circumstances so that they can find real truth. So you would not use anecdotal experience. That's one fallacy, the fallacy of anecdotal experience. As well, an appeal to authority. And you will find this very, very often, especially in sorry, low battery warning. Especially in kind of the pulp fiction, or not, like the paperback versions of philosophy and apologetics, you'll find a lot of appeals to authority. And there's invisible ones and visible ones. Some people will audibly say, physically say, I am an expert in XYZ, I've been studying in this field for this long, therefore when I say there is no God, it's true. Or they'll say, I'm a historian on Jesus studies, blah, 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 and I know that Jesus, was not God. Well, you can't ground a truth claim just based on your own experience. You need to bring proof. So you need to say, I'm an expert in the field, and here's my findings, and lay out your findings. And then we can have a discussion about your findings. But you can't just say, I'm an expert, therefore I'm right. That's not a valid argument. That's a logical fallacy, and it happens very often. Similarly, your pastor might say, well, look, I studied for years in seminary, and I have a bachelor's, and I have a master's, and I know the original languages, and therefore, this is how the end times are going to shake down, and I'm right. Well, that's an appeal to authority. That argument is invalid. You need to bring proof for your beliefs. And finally, red herring. This is like what I mentioned earlier. This rock is red, this rock is black, all roses are red, therefore this rock is coal. A red herring is a statement that might be true, might be false, but it has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And in fact, it's an attempt to take us off into left field, to distract us, to distract us from the actual point of discussion. The idea of a red herring is that you'd be hunting for perhaps a fox or perhaps a fugitive with dogs, and somebody, for some reason, some motivation, they would drag a fish across the trail, the scent trail that this fugitive or fox would have, and they would drag the fish off and then lead it off to perhaps a stream or something and let it go. And so that as the dogs are pursuing this trail, they would be sidetracked and distracted. And we need to be careful that people don't sidetrack us and distract us when we're pursuing truth and we're examining truth claims and we're on a track to try and find out whether this conclusion is true or false. Be wary of the red herring that's going to take us off into left field. Okay, there's some miscellaneous ones that were tremendously helpful to me when I saw this. Wow, this is a logical fallacy here. This is really helpful. Especially these first two, and then these three here, and then there's a few more that I'll just throw in for good measure. So the genetic fallacy. What the genetic fallacy says is that how you come to know truth doesn't affect whether it's true or not. Say, for example, you or I didn't study and examine to discover the periodic table. We were just taught that in school. That doesn't mean the periodic table is true or false. It just means that we personally didn't study it, right? So I think on that issue, or the multiplication table, we would understand, we would agree. Just because we were taught it, that doesn't mean it's true or false. How you come to know something doesn't affect whether it's true or false. Truth needs to stand on its own 2 feet, so to speak, apart from us. That's the whole definition of truth. Truth is true whether anyone believes it or not. Again, truth is reality as seen and described by God. Truth is what God knows. So, atheists and agnostics will often attack Christianity with the genetic fallacy, saying, for example, you were raised in a Christian home. Therefore, you believe Christianity is true. Therefore, your belief of Christianity must be false. That's the genetic fallacy. Look, how I came to believe doesn't affect whether the thing is true or false. And, I would have a much more compelling story if I could say I was raised an atheist, I had this whole life, and then I came to belief in Christianity, and this is, my story. But if that's not your story, that doesn't affect the truth of Christianity. Something to illustrate this is, well, what about your children? You, Mr. Atheist, are you going to have children one day? How will you raise them? Likely you'll raise them as atheists because you've done all this research and process to decide that atheism is correct. You're going to raise them in atheism, and they're going to believe atheism because they learn it from you. How you come to believe something does not affect whether that thing is true or false. Another interesting one, which is fairly easy to explain, it's called hurling the elephant, and it's not so much of of a logical fallacy as it's a debating technique. And it's also related to the power of the list or the fallacy of the heap. If you just throw enough information at somebody quickly enough, they just kind of become overwhelmed and say, wow. You know, like somebody could say, well, the Bible is outdated and Jesus never walked the earth. And, you know, we celebrate Christmas on the 25th, but we actually know that that's not when Jesus was born. And, you know, like they might throw together a whole list of things that they've thought through that are all objections to Christianity. Some of them true, some of them complete bogus, some of them somewhere in between. But when there's a whole list of things thrown at you, you sometimes get, wow, this is really hard to deal with. And so the way to deal with that is just to say, look, this is too much. Let's take things point by point, one thing at a time. And then we can look at what the conclusions are, what the premises are, and we can go from there. The excluded middle is another very, very common one. This is the last hard one I'm going to do, and then there's just two more that are really easy. So hang in there. I'm almost done. The excluded middle, that's when you say a statement, and it makes it feel as though there's only two options, or perhaps three or more options. But there's some options that are excluded by the way that you say the question. And perhaps the options that you're excluding are the very options that are the truth. For example, I could say to you, when are you going to stop beating up your roommate? And you would say to me, well, actually, that might be true. You should stop beating up your roommate. When are you going to stop strangling your roommate? And you would say, what are you going to say to that? You're going to say, I'm going to stop tomorrow? I'm going to stop never? I'm never going to stop until he's dead? What are you going to say? See, it leaves you without being able to say, I'm not beating my roommate. And so there's an excluded middle. There's no option in this question, the way it's stated, for saying this isn't the reality. It tries to box you into only one or two. Either I'm going to stop tomorrow or I'm never going to stop. When in reality, you're not even beating him. So that's another logical fallacy, that the fallacy of the excluded middle. Okay, then there's a straw man argument. I think you're familiar with that. I think you know what I mean by that. It's building an overly simplistic idea of your opponent's ideas so that you can knock it over very easily. For example, there can be no kind father in the sky because of the wars and diseases in the world. Well, and I actually heard somebody say that in high school. No kind father in the sky. Well, you know, Christians don't simply believe in some kind father in the sky. The Trinity is so much more complex than that, so much more rich than that. That's just a straw man attempt to build this caricature of God and say, this kind father can't survive in this world that actually is. And that argument just, you know, it's easy to knock it over just like a straw man like that. Finally, the ad hominem attack. Ad hominem, just hominem means man, ad means against. Attacking the man, saying, you are stupid. What you are saying is wrong. Rather than dealing with the actual objections, trying to destroy character, trying to destroy credibility, trying to destroy the person. And I have good news for you. If you master this content, and if you become a great apologist, you will have ad hominem attacks against you, just like Paul and Stephen did. And this is tremendously good news for you, because the great problem that our evangelical churches have, and many pastors have, is that they're ignored, that their message is not relevant enough to attack. Because they're not hitting anywhere near the mark. They're not converting people. They're not changing people's minds. And my prayer for you is that you can learn to think very clearly, systematically, to create a storehouse of knowledge so that when you have the opportunity, you're invited into a discussion. What about this? What about that? You can bring such good arguments that just like Stephen and just like Paul, you can confound people in a gracious and a kind and a loving way, to such an extent that they say, you've destroyed all of my arguments. You're a very kind and gracious person, but you have just destroyed everything that I believed was true by the power and force of your words. And you will invite people either to convert at that point or to start attacking you as a human being and saying, you are an evil person, you know, tearing down your credibility and bringing the persecution that Jesus promised would come if we are faithful to him. And so my prayer for you is that you would become a successful apologist that will not simply be ignored, but will actually be somebody that is worth persecuting, and somebody that that is able to argue successfully enough that the only answer that people will have is an ad hominem attack. And I hope that that does encourage you when you are attacked in an ad hominem fashion. Well, maybe I should just say before I end, thanks a lot for this opportunity. It's been a blast, and I hope that this material has been helpful to you.